The sun rose slowly over the dusty hills of the southwestern plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was dry and sharp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant hint of smoke from a nearby settler cabin. Among these hills, a young Apache woman named Nayeli moved carefully through the tall grasses, her eyes scanning the horizon. She was only 18, yet life had already taught her more hardship than many people face in a lifetime. Her family had survived raids, harsh winters, and the constant pressure of settlers pushing into their lands. Now, a new challenge weighed heavily on her heart, a challenge that had nothing to do with nature or survival in the open plains. Nayeli was being forced into a marriage with a man she did not know, a man much older than herself, a cowboy who owned land not far from her family's home. It had happened suddenly. Only a few weeks ago, her father, tired of the threats from settlers and the ever-tightening control of local authorities, had reluctantly agreed to the marriage. Nayeli had protested quietly, as loudly as she dared, but her words fell on her father's weary ears. He believed that by marrying her to the cowboy, she would be protected, her family would gain some favor with the settlers, and she would have a future in a changing world. Nayeli could not understand the reasoning. How could marrying a stranger, a man so much older, provide any kind of safety? All she could feel was fear, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. The cowboy, whose name was Samuel Harper, was a man in his 40s with graying hair and rough, calloused hands. He had lived on the plains for most of his adult life, working tirelessly to maintain his ranch and his independence. He had never married before, though there were whispers in the town about women who had come and gone in his life. He had a stern face, lined by years under the sun, and a presence that demanded attention. To Nayeli, he seemed like a giant shadow, looming over her world, a man she did not trust and did not wish to know. On the morning of the wedding, Nayeli's family gathered in silence. Her mother tried to offer comforting words, but they sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her younger siblings clung to her skirts, sensing the tension in the air but not understanding it. Nayeli's heart pounded as she put on the simple dress her mother had stitched for the occasion. It was plain, but neat, meant to honor tradition without attracting too much attention. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip heavy with regret and worry. "Be strong," he whispered. Nayeli nodded, though inside, her mind raced with doubt and fear. The ceremony was brief. The local minister spoke of duty, community, and the sanctity of marriage, his words blending into the background for Nayeli. She hardly heard them. All she could focus on was the man standing before her, waiting for a bond that she had no desire to form. Samuel, for his part, seemed awkward and uncomfortable. He was not cruel, but he was distant, unsure how to approach the young woman thrust into his life. He muttered words of greeting and tried to offer a polite bow. But Nayeli could sense the difference between courtesy and true warmth. The ride to Samuel's homestead was silent. Nayeli sat rigidly in the wagon, hands folded tightly in her lap. The plains stretched endlessly around them, golden grass waving in the wind, and the occasional shape of a distant mountain breaking the horizon. She could feel the tension radiating from the man beside her. He wanted something from this marriage, a partner, perhaps a companion, but she refused to give him even the smallest portion of her trust. The journey felt long, each mile stretching out like an eternity. When they arrived at the homestead, Nayeli took in the small house and the surrounding land. It was modest, with a single stable, a fenced corral, and a garden struggling to thrive in the dry soil. The house itself was built from weathered wood, sturdy but plain. This would be her new home, the place where she would spend the rest of her days, whether she wanted to or not. She followed Samuel inside, trying to ignore the way her stomach knotted with fear. The first days were difficult. Nayeli kept to herself, performing the chores she was expected to do, while Samuel went about his own work. He fed the animals, repaired fences, and tended to the small garden, never pushing too close but always present. Nayeli resented the quiet authority he seemed to hold over every corner of the property. She refused to speak more than necessary, refused to smile or make any gesture that might suggest approval or affection. Samuel noticed her distance, but he did not push. Perhaps he understood, deep down, that forcing her to accept him would only make matters worse. Evenings were the hardest. The house felt too small, too quiet, and too empty. Nayeli would sit by the small fireplace, staring into the flames, thinking of her family and the life she had known before. She missed the open sky of her home, the familiar voices of her people, and the laughter that had once filled her days. Here, everything felt foreign. She felt trapped, but also determined. She would not give Samuel power over her heart. Over time, she began to observe him more carefully. Samuel was not unkind. He would leave small gifts of food or firewood, perform little acts of consideration, and never demanded more than what was expected. He had his own loneliness, a quiet ache that mirrored hers in ways she could not admit. Nayeli noticed how he would pause to watch the sunset, how he carefully tended the garden, and how he spoke softly to the animals, as if they understood him. Despite her fear and resentment, she could not help but see the human being beneath the rough exterior. Still, she rejected any closeness. When he attempted to speak to her during meals, or offer a gentle hand on her shoulder, she recoiled, her body and mind unwilling to accept what she could not yet trust. Samuel seemed to understand this instinctively. He did not force his presence upon her, instead, choosing patience. He worked quietly, always near, but never imposing, giving her space while maintaining the necessary routines of their shared life. The neighbors and townspeople watched the pair with curiosity and quiet judgment. Some pitied Nayeli, recognizing the unfairness of her situation. Others respected Samuel's restraint, noting that he had not mistreated her, despite the forced nature of their union. Rumors circulated, but the couple remained largely private, bound together by circumstance, but separated by emotional distance. Nayeli found moments of solace in small routines. She would rise early to gather water, tend to the garden, and watch the sunrise over the plains. In these moments, she felt a fragile sense of freedom, a reminder of who she was before this marriage. She clung to her traditions, whispering prayers in her own language, remembering stories told by her elders, and keeping the memory of her family alive in her heart. These rituals gave her strength to endure, reminding her that she had not entirely lost herself. Yet, there were moments of fear and doubt. She wondered how long she could bear this life, how she could survive emotionally in a world that seemed determined to strip her of choice. She questioned whether she would ever be able to trust Samuel, or any man, again. And in the quiet moments before sleep, she felt the full weight of isolation pressing down on her, a reminder of the life she had been forced to leave behind. Despite all this, a tiny spark of curiosity began to grow. Nayeli could not yet admit it to herself, but she was noticing small gestures of kindness and care from Samuel. His presence, once so imposing, began to feel less threatening, though she still kept her distance. She was learning to observe without judgment, to watch the man who shared her space and recognize his humanity without surrendering her own. By the end of the first month, life had settled into a fragile rhythm. Nayeli continued to resist intimacy, continued to guard her heart, but she had begun to understand the dynamics of her new world. Samuel remained patient, steady, and careful, never pushing boundaries he sensed she was not ready to cross. The days were long and often lonely, but in the quiet persistence of routine, there was a strange, unspoken acknowledgement of each other's existence. Nayeli did not know what the future held. She did not know whether she would ever come to accept this marriage fully, or if she would forever keep her heart apart from Samuel's. But one thing was certain: she would endure. And in the wide open plains where danger and uncertainty were constant companions, she would find a way to hold on to herself. no matter the cost. The sun set again, casting long shadows across the homestead, and Nayeli sat quietly by the fire, her mind filled with memories, fears, and the faintest flicker of something she could not yet name. Life had changed, yes, but it had not defeated her. She was young, strong, and determined. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through every trial before. The days at the homestead stretched long and often felt empty. Nayeli moved through each one with careful precision, keeping her thoughts guarded and her heart distant. The early mornings were her favorite, when the sky was painted in soft oranges and pinks and the air still held a chill. She would step outside to fill the water buckets from the well, her hands stiff from the cold, listening to the distant calls of birds as they began their day. The land around the homestead was wide and open, with rolling hills and patches of wild grasses that danced in the breeze. It reminded her, in small ways, of the lands she had grown up in. Though here, everything felt controlled, confined, and unfamiliar. Samuel Harper had settled into his own routines as well. He rose before sunrise, tending to the animals with careful hands, feeding the horses and checking the fences for any weak spots. He would repair the tools and maintain the small garden with a patient diligence. He never spoke much during these early hours, and Nayeli appreciated the silence. Words were not always necessary, and she had learned to observe him from a distance. She noticed small things, the way he paused to examine a damaged fence post, the careful way he handled the animals, and the faint line of worry that appeared across his forehead at times. These were signs of a man who cared, though not in ways she could yet accept. Their lives together were filled with chores and routines, each task a small test of patience and endurance. Nayeli tended the kitchen and the house, cleaning and cooking with quiet precision. Samuel's attempts to involve her in decisions or to share conversations were met with polite distance. She would nod or respond with short phrases, careful to keep herself separate. Sometimes he would watch her as she worked, his expression unreadable. Nayeli would feel a flicker of discomfort at his gaze and quickly turn her attention elsewhere. She had built walls around her heart, and she did not intend to let them crumble easily. Neighbors and settlers in the nearby area were curious about the pair. Some had whispered about the forced marriage, expressing sympathy for Nayeli and caution for Samuel. A few women would occasionally bring baked goods or offer friendly visits, and Nayeli would receive them politely but remained reserved. Samuel, on the other hand, kept his interactions brief and practical, focused more on work than gossip. The small community watched them carefully, unsure if the marriage would survive, yet few dared to interfere directly. Despite the outward calm, Nayeli's inner world was in constant turmoil. She struggled with feelings of anger and resentment, frustrated that her life had been shaped by forces beyond her control. She missed her family terribly, the familiar sounds, the laughter, and the sense of belonging. At night, when the house was quiet and the fire crackled low in the fireplace, she would whisper prayers in her own language, speaking softly of her hopes and fears. These moments of solitude were precious, reminders that she still had her identity, her strength, and her connection to her heritage. Samuel, too, was not untouched by the situation. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, knowing that Nayeli had been forced into this life against her will. He did not attempt to force closeness, understanding that trust could not be demanded. Instead, he tried to demonstrate care through actions rather than words. He would leave firewood stacked near the door, repair broken tools, or ensure the animals were fed properly. These small gestures were his way of showing respect, a silent promise that he would not harm her and would share the burdens of daily life. One afternoon, a minor incident tested their fragile relationship. A stray calf had wandered into the nearby brush, tangled in thorny branches and bleating frantically. Nayeli spotted it first, her instincts guiding her toward action. She called for Samuel, her voice firm but calm. Together, they worked to free the frightened animal. Samuel's strong hands carefully untangled the branches while Nayeli held the calf steady, murmuring soothing words. For the first time in many weeks, they worked side by side, moving in silent coordination. There was no conversation, no acknowledgement beyond necessity, yet in that shared effort, a small shift began to occur. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the sky in fiery reds and deep purples, Nayeli found herself reflecting on the day. She realized that Samuel's calm presence had made the difference. He had not shouted or forced the animal's release. He had worked with care, respect, and patience. Nayeli felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a cautious appreciation. She quickly pushed it aside, reminding herself that it was dangerous to allow any warmth to enter her heart. Trust was not something she could give lightly, especially in a life that had already taken so much from her. Days passed in similar rhythms, punctuated by small, unexpected moments. Samuel would sometimes speak of the land, of planting seasons or the weather, and Nayeli would listen, answering only when necessary. Occasionally, he shared stories of his own past, tales of hardships, losses, and fleeting joys. Nayeli listened quietly, recognizing in his words the loneliness that mirrored her own. Yet, she still held herself apart, refusing to let familiarity turn into affection. A turning point came one morning when a severe thunderstorm swept across the plains. The wind howled, and rain fell in sheets, drenching the homestead and turning the dirt paths into thick mud. The animals became restless. The fences strained against the wind, and the house itself creaked under the force of the storm. Nayeli felt her pulse quicken as the storm raged outside, fear gripping her heart. Samuel moved calmly, methodically securing the animals and checking the house for leaks. Nayeli helped where she could, carrying buckets of water to reinforce weak spots in the foundation and moving animals to safer areas. Throughout the storm, they were forced to work together more closely than ever before. Nayeli could see the care in Samuel's actions, the thoughtfulness with which he ensured her safety as well as his own. He offered no unnecessary words, only actions that spoke of concern and responsibility. In those long hours of shared struggle, Nayeli began to feel something shift. The distance she had maintained, the walls she had built so carefully, seemed less absolute. She was still cautious, still wary, but she could not deny the sense of partnership that had emerged in the face of danger. After the storm passed, the homestead was in disarray, but no lives were lost, and the animals were safe. Exhausted, they sat together in silence by the fireplace, drying clothes and tending minor injuries. Nayeli's hands were scraped and bruised from the day's work, and Samuel noticed without comment, simply offering her water and a clean cloth. She accepted it silently, the small gesture carrying more meaning than words could express. For the first time, she allowed herself a moment of rest in his presence, feeling the steady calm that radiated from him. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to routine, but the memory of the storm lingered. Nayeli found herself observing Samuel more closely, noticing the subtle ways he managed the land and cared for those around him. She saw him helping a neighbor with a broken fence, sharing tools, and offering advice without expecting gratitude. These acts of kindness, performed without fanfare or expectation, began to chip away at the bitterness she had carried. She did not yet trust him, nor did she wish to, but she could acknowledge his humanity and even respect it. Evenings became slightly less lonely. Nayeli would sit by the fire while Samuel worked nearby, performing his own tasks, and they would exchange brief words about the day. There were no deep conversations, no declarations of friendship or warmth, but the silence was no longer oppressive. It was shared, a quiet understanding that they were two people navigating the difficulties of life together. Nayeli began to see that Samuel was not the enemy. He was simply a man shaped by his own experiences, living in a world that demanded toughness and resilience. The bond between them remained fragile, but it was real. Nayeli still felt the weight of her forced marriage, still mourned the life she had lost, but she also began to recognize moments of connection. Small gestures, a hand offered to steady a bucket, a nod of approval for a task well done, a shared glance during chores became symbols of a growing, if cautious, understanding. Trust was not yet present, but the foundations of it were slowly forming. As winter approached, the plains grew colder, the days shorter and harsher. Nayeli prepared for the coming months with a mixture of determination and apprehension. She knew that life would continue to challenge her, that fear and uncertainty were constant companions. Yet, she also knew that she was not entirely alone. Samuel's presence, once so intimidating, had become a part of her daily life, a steady rhythm she could rely on. In quiet moments, she allowed herself to reflect on the changes within her. She had survived the first months of a life she had not chosen, navigated the hardships of the plains, and begun to recognize the humanity of the man she had once viewed only as a captor. She did not yet know what the future would hold, whether affection or friendship would ever bloom, but she understood one vital truth: endurance, patience, and careful observation were her greatest allies. And so, life continued. Days were filled with work, evenings with quiet reflection, and nights with whispered prayers for guidance and strength. Nayeli remained cautious, still guarding her heart, but a subtle shift had occurred. She had begun to see Samuel not just as the man who had taken her into this life, but as a human being capable of care, respect, and perhaps, in time, trust. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges both small and great. But for the first time, Nayeli felt a sense of possibility, however faint, that life might hold more than hardship and loneliness. The winter months had begun to settle over the plains, painting the hills in muted browns and grays, and leaving the wind sharper, colder, and less forgiving. Snow dusted the distant peaks, while frost clung to the edges of the homestead in the mornings. Nayeli rose before dawn, her breath misting in the cold air, as she prepared for the day. She had grown stronger in recent months, learning not just the routines of the homestead, but also how to endure life with patience and quiet resilience. Her muscles ached less from daily chores, and she moved with a sense of purpose she had not felt when she first arrived. Still, her heart remained guarded, carefully shielded from the man who shared her home. Samuel had also changed in subtle ways. He had begun to recognize the young woman's strength and intelligence, admiring her ability to navigate the work of the homestead with skill and care. He was careful not to overstep, understanding that trust could not be demanded. Instead, he allowed her space while remaining present in her life, offering assistance without expectation. There were moments when their eyes met across the room or the yard, brief flashes of understanding that spoke louder than any words. Both knew that the distance between them was shrinking, though neither would admit it aloud. One morning, a small accident set the stage for a profound change. Nayeli had been gathering firewood near the edge of the property, where the land dipped into a narrow ravine. A loose patch of ice caused her to slip, and she tumbled down a short slope, twisting her ankle badly. She cried out in pain, her voice sharp against the cold wind. Samuel, who had been tending the horses nearby, heard her and ran toward the sound. His heart pounded as he saw her struggling, the pain evident in her face. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, speaking softly to calm her fear while examining the injury. "Easy, Nayeli. Let's get you inside," he said, his voice steady and calm. He lifted her carefully, supporting her weight as she gritted her teeth against the pain. Every step was slow and deliberate, but Samuel made sure she felt safe. Nayeli, though embarrassed by her fall and the need for assistance, did not pull away. She realized, in that moment, how much she depended on him not just for physical help, but for a sense of stability she had never known since being brought to this place. Inside the house, Samuel helped her to a chair by the fire, propping her ankle on a cushion and wrapping it with a cloth to keep it warm. He brewed a small pot of herbal tea, a mixture he had learned from an old neighbor, and handed it to her gently. Nayeli accepted it, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers and into her chest. She did not speak at first, simply staring at the flames as the fire crackled. For the first time, she allowed herself to notice the quiet care in Samuel's actions, the way he moved with purpose and respect. Over the next several days, Nayeli's injury forced her to slow down and accept help more than she ever had before. Samuel assisted her with chores she could no longer perform, fetching water, feeding the animals, and preparing meals. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Dependence, even temporary, felt foreign and uncomfortable, yet it also revealed a truth she could not deny. Samuel was capable of care without cruelty, without arrogance, and without expectation. Slowly, a seed of trust began to take root, though she guarded it carefully. During this time, they shared moments that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Samuel sat with her by the fire, a blanket draped over both their shoulders. He told stories of his youth, of travels across distant plains, and the small victories and losses that had shaped him. Nayeli listened, sometimes interjecting quietly with questions about the land or animals, sometimes simply letting his words wash over her. In these moments, she began to see the man beyond the rough exterior, the man who had endured hardship, loneliness, and responsibility, yet remained capable of gentleness. One afternoon, a minor crisis arose on the homestead. The river near the property, swollen by melting snow, began to flood part of the garden, threatening their food supply. Nayeli and Samuel rushed outside to assess the damage. They worked together, reinforcing small dikes with sandbags and moving vulnerable plants to safer ground. Their movements were coordinated, almost instinctive, a dance of necessity that required communication without arrogance or force. Nayeli realized that in these moments, she felt something unexpected, a sense of partnership, even reliance, on someone she had once viewed with suspicion. Through these shared trials, Nayeli's perception of Samuel began to shift in subtle ways. She noticed the patience in his eyes, the careful thought behind each action, and the unspoken respect he showed her in allowing her to take the lead when appropriate. He did not belittle her skills or opinions, even though he was the elder and the property owner. This quiet acknowledgement of her abilities and intelligence stirred something within her. A recognition that her life, though forced into this path, was not entirely defined by her initial fear and resentment. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Samuel suggested they walk to the nearby hills to check on the fences. Nayeli hesitated, her ankles still tender, but she agreed, relying on his steady presence. As they walked together, the wind whipping around them, they spoke quietly about small things, how the animals were faring, the direction of the winds, and the subtle signs of approaching weather. There was no need for grand declarations. The conversation itself, simple and practical, was a bridge between them. Nayeli found herself listening closely, noticing the sincerity in his words, and for the first time, she felt a small flicker of comfort in his presence. That night, after returning to the house, Samuel offered to help Nayeli with a simple task, mending a tear in her clothing. She sat quietly as he worked, the needle moving deftly in his hands. The closeness, though silent and unassuming, was a moment of connection. Nayeli could feel the warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of Samuel's hands, and the unspoken understanding that he meant no harm. She allowed herself to remain in that space, recognizing that trust could be small, slow, and quiet before it became anything more. Days turned into weeks, and the cold winter continued. Nayeli's ankle healed, and with it, her perception of Samuel shifted further. She still kept her heart guarded, still refused intimacy or familiarity, but she began to accept the presence of another human being in her life, without fear. She realized that her own strength did not have to be solitary strength. It could exist alongside recognition of someone else's care and effort. During one particularly harsh snowstorm, the wind driving cold flakes against the windows, Nayeli and Samuel were forced to remain indoors for several days. They cooked together, repaired broken tools, and tended to the animals as best they could. In the evenings, they would sit near the fire, speaking softly of survival, of the work that still needed to be done, and of memories that each held from the past. Nayeli began to feel a strange sense of companionship. A quiet acknowledgement that, even in a life that had been forced upon her, she was not completely alone. The bond between them, though still fragile, had begun to solidify in unexpected ways. Nayeli found herself laughing quietly at Samuel's dry humor, noticing the care he took in small details, and appreciating his efforts without needing to express it aloud. Samuel, in turn, seemed more patient, more thoughtful, and increasingly aware of her strengths and boundaries. They had learned, through shared work, danger, and endurance, that connection did not require consent in grand gestures. It could be forged slowly, quietly, and with respect. By the end of the winter, Nayeli felt a sense of resilience that was deeper than before. She understood that the world was harsh and often unfair, that life could force choices upon people, but that even in such circumstances, trust and respect could grow. She did not yet feel affection, nor did she expect to, but she had begun to accept Samuel as a companion in survival, a person whose presence could be reliable and steady. In a life that had once felt entirely alien and threatening, she had discovered the first threads of understanding and cautious acceptance. In the quiet of one evening, as they sat together mending tools and preparing for the next day, Nayeli realized how much had changed. She no longer viewed Samuel solely as the man who had taken her into this life. She saw a human being flawed, experienced, patient, and capable of care. She recognized that survival was not merely about enduring physical hardships, but about learning to navigate relationships, trust, and understanding in a world that demanded resilience. The night fell, and the wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the homestead. Nayeli sat quietly by the fire, feeling the warmth on her skin and the quiet steadiness of Samuel's presence nearby. She did not need to speak, nor did she need to force herself to feel affection. The simple act of coexistence, of shared work, and of mutual recognition had shifted something inside her. She was learning that trust could be slow, patience could yield connection, and even a forced union could contain moments of understanding and respect. As she drifted into sleep, Nayeli felt a quiet hope, a fragile, delicate possibility that life could hold more than hardship and fear. She did not know what the future would bring, whether true affection or companionship would ever grow. But she understood that endurance, observation, and careful openness could create a new kind of strength. And in the vast, cold expanse of the plains, with a man once unknown and distant now a cautious presence in her life, she found herself ready to face whatever challenges awaited, one day at a time. The early spring brought a subtle warmth to the plains, coaxing new life from the earth. The cold grip of winter had loosened, and the days became longer, the sun staying up just a little bit more each day. For Nayeli, the changing season was both a relief and a reminder of how much had shifted in her life over the past few months. She had come to accept the rhythm of life at the homestead, the steady routines that kept them busy from dawn until dusk. The work itself no longer felt as heavy as it once had. In fact, she had begun to appreciate the small triumphs of each day, when the fences were mended, when the animals were fed, when a meal was prepared without incident. There was a sense of accomplishment, even if it was quiet and often unspoken. Samuel, too, had settled into a rhythm. He moved with less urgency than before, his presence more grounded now that the immediate pressures of survival had eased. He had never been a man of many words, and over time, Nayeli had come to realize that his silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply his way. He was not distant, just reserved, and she had grown accustomed to the way he spoke through actions rather than conversation. She no longer felt the same wariness when he came near, no longer recoiled when he moved to help her. There was an understanding between them now, a quiet partnership that had formed over time, one that neither of them had expected, but which neither could deny. That evening, after a long day of working in the garden and preparing for the coming planting season, the sky turned an extraordinary shade of orange and pink. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the homestead. The wind had died down, and there was a sense of calm in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Nayeli had just finished washing the last of the dishes when Samuel stepped out onto the small porch and called to her. "Want to take a walk?" he asked, his voice steady but inviting. Nayeli hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. She had grown used to the solitude of the homestead, and though Samuel's company no longer felt like a burden, she still found herself unsure of these small moments that could easily tip into something more. Yet, the offer was simple enough, and the evening felt too peaceful to refuse. "Sure," she replied, her voice soft but sincere. They walked in silence at first, side by side but with a distance that was comfortable. The ground beneath their feet was firm, the spring air sweet with the smell of fresh grass and wildflowers beginning to bloom. As they moved, Samuel occasionally pointed out a patch of land he planned to work on, or a new calf in the barn, and Nayeli responded with short comments, more interested in the rhythm of walking than in talking. They passed the fields, the far-off hills, the small grove of trees near the river where Samuel had shown her how to fish months earlier. All of it felt familiar now, not quite home. After a while, they reached the hill that overlooked the homestead. From here, they could see the house in the distance, the barn, and the few outbuildings. The landscape stretched out before them, wide and open. And in that moment, Nayeli felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she could still find. There was something about the land, this vast, untamed place, that had a way of making the worries of the world feel small. They stopped at the top of the hill, the evening sun painting their faces with soft light. Samuel stood a few paces away, his hands resting in his pockets, watching the view. Nayeli stood beside him, gazing out at the land that had become her world. "It's beautiful here," she said, almost to herself. Samuel turned to her, a slight nod of his head, acknowledging her words. "It is. It's quiet, peaceful, in its own way." She glanced at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time in a long while. His expression was calm, thoughtful, as it always was. But there was something else there, a softness, a gentleness that she hadn't seen before. It caught her off guard, and for a moment, the weight of their shared life together seemed to settle between them. "Do you ever miss?" She paused, not sure how to finish the question. Her voice faltered slightly. "Miss what?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "My people. My home. Before all this." Her voice was quiet, but there was no denying the pain beneath the words. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the distant call of birds returning to their nests for the evening. Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, and for the first time, Nayeli could see the understanding in his eyes. He had lived a life of his own, full of loss and isolation, but he had never had to endure the displacement, the grief, that she had. Still, in his silence, there was empathy. "I miss a lot of things," he said finally, his voice low. "I miss people. I miss the days when I thought I had more time for living. But you can't change what's happened. You can only make the best of what's left." Nayeli absorbed his words, turning them over in her mind. It was true. She had spent so much time holding on to the past, to the life she had been forced to leave behind, that she had forgotten to appreciate what was in front of her. This homestead, this place, this man who had slowly become a part of her life in ways she hadn't expected they were hers now. The future was still uncertain, but the present was something she could touch, something she could shape. They stood together in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, until the first stars began to appear in the evening sky. The air had cooled, and Nayeli pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe we should head back," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah," Samuel agreed, glancing at her before starting back down the hill. "We've got work tomorrow." The walk back to the homestead was slower, more deliberate. The distance between them had closed without either of them forcing it, and for the first time, Nayeli found herself not just accepting Samuel's presence, but appreciating it. It was still a complicated thing, this marriage, this life, but it was no longer something she faced with only fear and resentment. It was, in its own way, hers to navigate, and Samuel, though a man with whom she had no prior connection, was a part of that world. As they reached the porch of the house, Samuel turned to her, his expression still thoughtful. "You know, it's not always easy, this life, but it's what we make of it." Nayeli met his gaze, and for the first time, she smiled, just a small, tentative curve of her lips, but it was real. "I'm starting to see that," she said quietly. Later that night, after the chores were done and they were both sitting by the fire, the flickering light casting shadows across the room, Samuel did something he hadn't done before. He spoke without hesitation, without the usual reserve that marked his every interaction with her. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice rough, but steady. "I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm glad you stayed." Nayeli looked up at him, her heart catching in her chest. She had not expected such a confession, not from a man who had always seemed so guarded. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond, but the words came, unbidden, as though they had always been there, waiting for the right moment. "I'm glad, too," she said softly. The fire crackled between them, but there was a different kind of warmth in the room now. Not the heat from the flames, but something else, something quieter, more lasting. They sat in silence for a while, each of them allowing the weight of their words to settle. And in that moment, Nayeli realized that this was how trust grew, not in grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in small moments, in shared spaces, and in the quiet acknowledgement of each other's humanity. The night passed, and they went to bed as they had done countless times before. But this night was different. For the first time, there was no wall between them. It was not that they had suddenly become close, or that everything had changed in an instant, but the distance between them had narrowed, and for the first time, Nayeli felt the soft stirrings of something that could one day be something more. Friendship, perhaps, or something even deeper. As the stars shone brightly above, Nayeli closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind, the soft creak of the house, and the quiet, steady presence of Samuel in the next room. She did not know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. One day at a time, side by side, they would build a life together, one that was theirs, no longer defined by fear or obligation, but by the slow, steady work of understanding, respect, and, perhaps, something deeper. And that was enough.